Okay, well, welcome to this Colossians Bible study. We're working through the book of Colossians verse by verse. Today, we're going to be looking at Colossians chapter 3, verse 18 to chapter 4, verse 1. So we'll get in and we'll read the verses and then we'll have a chat about them. It reads like this: Wives, submit to your husbands, as is fitting in the Lord. Husbands, love your wives and do not be harsh with them. Children, obey your parents in everything, for this pleases the Lord. Fathers, do not embitter your children, or they will become discouraged. Slaves, obey your earthly masters in everything, and do it not only when their eye is on you and to curry favor, but with sincerity of heart and reverence for the Lord. Whatever you do, work at it with all your heart as working for the Lord, not for human masters, since you know that you will receive an inheritance from the Lord as a reward. It is the Lord Christ you are serving. Anyone who does wrong will be repaid for their wrongs, and there is no favoritism. Masters, provide for your slaves with what is right and fair, because you know that you also have a master in heaven. So there's some big themes to unpack in these verses, isn't there? And so Dr. John, we'll come to you first. In these verses, we do see some roles spoken about and described in a way that can seem quite far removed from today's society. And so just kind of zooming out big picture for a moment, how can we kind of make sense of these verses? Are they even relevant today?
Good question. Relationships between husbands, wives, parents and children, they are as relevant today as they ever were. The roles, of course, of women have changed, particularly over the last 100 years. But that is not the case everywhere in the world, certainly not the case everywhere in the world. The practice of masters owning slaves, thankfully, is now outdated and eliminated. But tragically, modern day slavery has not been eliminated from the world. I think the key message here from Paul, whatever situation you find yourself in, he says, work at it. Whatever you do, work at it with all your heart as working for the Lord, not for human masters. In that situation, it may not be a good situation, but you're a witness for Jesus in that situation that you're in.
That's really helpful. Thanks, Dr. John, just for opening that up for us. And so what we're going to do is we're going to just kind of talk about each of these verses a little bit more. We'll just hone in on some of them here. And I suppose as we do, we're going to try and dig into what the Bible is what wisdom it has to offer us that can help us today. We'll come to you next, Amy. Verse 18, it says, wives, submit to your husbands as is fitting to the Lord. So here's the question. Does this mean that God views women as inferior to men?
No, he does not. So I think what's helpful is to really look at the word submission.
Great.
What does it mean? What does it not mean?
Great.
I think we can often view that word through our cultural lens. And the sort of connotations that surround it are not actually accurate of what that word means. So if we look at what the word means, it means that you recognize that somebody has authority over you. So that does mean that there is an order of authority, but it also means that you're part of a team. So my husband sat next to me. So as for me and my husband, we're a team. We're a parenting team. We've got a daughter, and so we're a unit, we're a family. But as with any team, there needs to be a leader. Because with a leader, then there's going to be direction. But even if you look at the word submission as in and of itself, you can split it into sub and mission. There is a mission for Christian marriage,
really
and that is to glorify and obey God. And submission says that I'm going to put myself under that mission. So that's kind of looking at the word submission. What does it not mean? Well, it does not mean that men are more valuable than women or vice versa. Doesn't mean that we are inferior. Submission does not mean silence. It also does not mean to any man in general. It says that I am to submit to my husband. This is in the context of marriage, which is really important.
It's really good.
And also as well, submission, it's not a forced submission to some tyrannical husband, but it's a submission that's birthed of love. And if you go back to Ephesians, it says that husbands are told to love their wives as Christ loved the church and gave himself up for her. So there's a responsibility both ways, which I think is really helpful.
Right.
And if we look at how does God view women? Well, we're equal in value to men, but we are diverse in function. And we can see that we're equal as well, because in Genesis chapter 1, you know, we are made in the image of God. So that's really important to note. But there's so much that we can learn for this. And I think for women, I think this is just an encouragement that if you are single, then it's really important that you take great care in choosing a husband, choosing somebody who you can respect and that you want to submit to as well. So there's so much that we can learn from this. But I think if we just really look at what the word submission means, I think actually you take away the sort of cultural aspect that perhaps we might look at that word.
That's really, really helpful. Thank you so much, Amy, for unpacking that for us. And you touched there just at the end, just looking at just the theme in general of submission, which kind of, if we zoom out to a broader biblical thing on that thing of submission, we see that Jesus submitted to the Father
Exactly.
in the person of the Trinity. And so if we presuppose that submission has any connotations of making the submitter less than in any way, then what we're saying is Jesus is less than God. And that, by definition, is not a Christian idea because 100%. We believe that Jesus is God. Exactly. So we can never go there. Pastor Fraser, I just wonder if you could just touch on that kind of other half of the dynamic where it touches their husbands, love your wives, you know, because that's a key part of the dynamic too, as Amy mentioned, isn't it?
Yeah, 100%. I think I really like what Amy's saying about the mission. Like, we're on a mission and, you know, we're part of a team and we each have a role to play. And it says in these verses, doesn't it? And husbands, love your wives. Right. And like Amy said in Ephesians, love your wives like Jesus loved the church. I mean, this is not like an easy order. And again, like looking at love through our cultural lens, it's like, what do I buy her flowers every now and again? Do we mean love like romance? Like it's, you know, I love her not. Like, oh, it's kind of, I've fallen out of love. You know, we say these silly things, but actually the word love that's used is agape. It is the Greek for it, which is not romance, but it's selfless, it's sacrificial, it's a serving love. It's not about emotion. It's not about my emotions, but it's about self-denial for the sake of a lover, for the sake of another. And it doesn't change. It's a giving love. It expects nothing in return. It's a love that, you know, is given not to get anything in return. It's a love that loves even when it's rejected. It's a love, you know, so we're talking about, you know, we think like wives submit, but then it's like husbands, you love your wife like Jesus loved the church. It's about lifting each other up. And it's a real challenge as well to husbands. Like actually do not be harsh. Do not, you know, I know it goes on in a different translation when it's talking about the parenting, you know, don't provoke them to anger. And I love that Paul is so absolutely revolutionary here in how he talks to, because lots of pagan moralists will have spoken to, you know, the children, women, slaves, and said, yeah, do this. But Paul doesn't just speak to them. He speaks to the people in perceived positions of power. He says, no, you need to love your wife like Jesus loved the church. And to go back to kind of the thing, does this make men and women, a women inferior to men? Absolutely not. Because Paul writes in Galatians, doesn't he? He says, there's no Greek or Jew. That's right. There's no slave or free. There's no man or woman. We are all one in Christ. We are absolutely equal in value in the eyes of the Lord. And Paul's not just calling us to be nice or kind, just to kind of wrap it up. He's not calling us to be nice or kind, or just nice or kind to our wives, but to continually practice self-denial for the sake of one another, because this is the kind of love that Jesus demonstrated.
That's beautiful, and that's really helpful. And I guess, yeah, as you say, it's part of that team like that. And that's the key thing there, isn't it? That he's covering husbands and wives, part of that team on that mission together. And interesting what you say about that kind of Paul speaking to the people in the perceived positions of power, actually, that there is a challenge there, actually, that they are to use that, you know, position that they have not in any kind of abusive way. It really has, you know, serious things to say for anyone who feels a kind of thing towards like wanting to abuse their power, doesn't there? And following that train of thought, it then moves on to another dynamic, Dr. John, where it looks at children and parents, saying in verse 20, children, obey your parents in everything, for this pleases the Lord. And then fathers, do not embitter your children, or they will become discouraged. What might we learn from these verses?
It's interesting to look at the word translated in bitter, if I can say it in the Greek, erythisieli, something like that anyway, which can be translated. Pastor Fraser brought a bit on this as well, different translations. It says being translated in bitter, it can mean translated aggravate, don't aggravate your children, don't provoke, don't irritate, or don't cause your children to become resentful. And it's interesting because Paul gives instructions to different groups of people. You know, the husbands, wives, slaves, masters, parents, children. And I think as we've brought out in the discussion, that each person in there has a responsibility. And so, yes, the children responsibility to obey the parents, but the parents have the responsibility not to cause the children to become resentful. And it's the same with the other groups that Paul refers to. And it's not one-sided. And I think that's a very important thing, because where things can go astray is where people focus in on one aspect.
That's
You
it.
just submit to me type of thing. But they don't look at the other side. It's love and whatever. So, Paul, yes, he's quite revolutionary what he's bringing, but he's looking at the each person in that kind of group.
That's really helpful. So I guess that he's almost touching on that there is a bit of a kind of a godly value there in children honoring their parents, but then also to have the idea that gives, in this position it speaks to fathers, that they can just have this overbearing, totally domineering way with their kids and say, I'm the dad, you have to do this, that, the other thing. That would be a profoundly unbiblical way of behaving, right?
Yeah, I think it's such great parenting advice as well, because actually we want our kids to grow up feeling loved, feeling encouraged and empowered. And I've got a daughter who's almost 3 years old now. And if I were to just pick on everything that she did and always tell her off and always, provoke her, then she's going to grow up feeling unloved and discouraged.
Right.
And don't get me wrong, there's a place for correction and discipline, but there is so much space for grace, forgiveness, for love. And actually, this is a really healthy recipe for building a healthy relationship with our kids. And actually, if we look to God as well, we're reminded of how much grace, love, and forgiveness that He has with us, whilst also correcting us lovingly. And so I think that actually we can look to God's example as our example when we're looking at parenting.
So good. So then moving forwards from there into the next dynamic there, which Paul addresses, which is between slaves and their masters, is the language he uses. And we see Paul give instructions about this. Now, Laulu, an irresponsible reading of these verses may lead us to the conclusion that, God is affirming a completely outdated and immoral system. But why is what Paul is saying here so different to that?
I mean, it's totally different. And and people, would try and, quote these verses again out of context, and they would try and say, oh, yes, well, he is trying to, encourage, slavery in the modern day. But I mean, actually, if we look at slavery, just in itself, I mean, this, it's predated, even like Jesus, coming to earth, and the Jewish nation. This was something that was, there like a long time ago, right. And we see Paul addressing this, and actually what Paul did, and why we see, I mean, the abolition of slavery now was, from these kind of principles, and was actually Paul bringing this up, not just to say, because in that time it was a really, core thing, in that kind of environment. But then actually Paul slowly bringing this up, I think, has actually helped in the modern day for the abolition of slavery. But then what Paul is addressing now, and the context in the modern day would be for, let's say, employers or for supervisors, rather than encouraging, for masters and slaves in this day. But then what Paul is encouraging is that in that day, this was ruled by just rules and regulations, by just telling people what to do. But then now actually Paul is encouraging people to love. Even we see the comparisons of parents and children, of husbands and wives, of, in this context, the slaves and the slave owners, who are saying, no, it's not about this domineering kind of effect that you want to have on people. No, it's about loving each other. And I think that's what Paul is trying to get at here, and that's why Paul is again trying to encourage people to not just be unfair to their slaves back in the day, but then actually to be just and fair, to treat them right. I know we see this, like I said, in the modern context, even in our workplaces, and of the likes of that as well.
That's really helpful. Thanks for bringing that out for us, Laulu. And I suppose that, it would be true that kind of in history, maybe there have been irresponsible people who have used certain verses to say like, oh, this means that slavery is justified, which is absolutely appalling and is totally wrong. But the truth is, like you say, that really when we take Christianity or what it is, what is it Jesus said? The two greatest commandments upon which everything else hangs: love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, and mind, and love your neighbor as yourself. And if we take that seriously, that totally undermines the whole idea and system of slavery there. Anything to add to that?
Yeah, I think in the context of the letter, when Paul was writing it, slavery was a normal part of practice of the society. And Paul's certainly not saying he approves of it, but I think Paul is being realistic in acknowledging that exists, not improving, but acknowledging that there is slavery. And of course, as Christianity spread, slaves were becoming Christians. So you got a kind of a tension there, where, yes, you had a system that was wrong, but you had Christians, slaves who were in that position. Should they rebel against the masters and run away? Well, that could cost them their lives. And I think what Paul is saying here, and it's the principle really of the kingdom of God, that if you're in a situation that find themselves, bad though it be, their good lives could honour God and be a powerful witness to others. And of course, Jesus said that the Son of Man didn't come to serve, but to be served, but to serve. And so I think the slaves in that position, although it's wrong, they could still be a good witness for Jesus by the way they behave.
It's really powerful. Thanks, Dr. John. And so then so we've looked at each of these dynamics here a little bit, and then I guess where I guess we come to a little bit is that these verses kind of show us the real importance and value of studying well when we come to conclusions from the Bible, and not just kind of reading a surface level view and assuming that we've come immediately to the right interpretation. Because Pastor Fraser, that could lead us down all sorts of false ways of looking at things. So I guess, any comment on that, on the importance of really studying the scripture well to draw accurate conclusions?
Yeah, I think it's never a bad thing to have questions. Like, I know you've asked some quite provocative questions throughout this, and I think it's no bad thing if we come to a text that we're struggling to understand to write down our questions.
Great.
And say, well, how does this fit in? Like, where does this fit? And then go to the context. Great. And there's loads of different contexts. And I guess we're getting into that, today. It's like, how does this fit in the context of the Bible itself? You bring up the two greatest commandments, which feed into this. Right. So how does this fit into the Bible as a whole? How does this fit into the passage as a whole? How does this fit into, there's historical context, isn't there? Like Dr. John's talking about, like, this isn't written in 2024 to the Junction church. Like, this letter is written to the church in Colossae in, whatever, I can't remember the conclusion we came to, AD. In the watch the first episode and you'll find out what I said probably as well. But it's written to a certain time. And if you think about how much history has changed, even in the last 30 years, I mean, phones, laptops, podcasts didn't exist. This would have been a radio show. If you think about how much times have changed and different things, it's really important to get that historical and cultural context of what's going on at the time as well. Like, what is Paul writing? Who's Paul writing to? What's he writing into? And I know we'll get into, next few videos, we'll get into a guy called Philemon who was a slave owner, and his slaves ran away. So Paul's writing, who's at the church in Colossae. So Paul's writing to all these different things, and it's really important that we get the context in the word, but also historical, cultural context. And if you're struggling with something, that's the beauty of church. It's the beauty of things like this. It's the beauty of having a life group leader. It's the beauty of having, the Dr. Johns, the Pastor Roys, the Pastor Leaders, the Pastor Jonas of this world that you can go to and say, hey, I've been studying this and this. I'm a bit challenged on this. Like, where does this fit in? Rather than throwing the baby out with the bathwater, or like, it's actually, delving in and saying, okay, what does this look like? And then it can lead us to tremendous truth, actually, and seeing how God works in these things as well. So I think it's good to have the questions, but then it's good to keep studying and not just assume, but talk to people who you trust, not just, your mate who's read the Bible once. Like, actually, talk to people who know what they're talking about, write the questions, and then go and, look into it, dig into it. Questions, no bad thing. Truth is not afraid of questions.
That's really good. What a powerful line there to finish that thought on. And I guess, it's been said that I can prove all things through a verse taken out of context, doesn't it? Actually, that people would say, oh, it's in the Bible, therefore the Bible's saying this. But that's just a complete falsity, isn't it? Because otherwise, sin's in the Bible. It's not saying that sin's good, but it's spoken about. And so it's kind of remembering that, okay, just because, things like these themes like slavery is in the Bible, it doesn't mean it's approving it. In fact, if we look at that angle, what is the Bible saying to
Yeah.
that theme? Actually it's totally undermining it, as we've just
And
said.
Paul's totally challenging the slavery thing. If we look at verse 1, he's
Right.
like, hey, treat them well.
Yeah.
You've got a master in heaven.
And even when you bring up Philemon, we'll come to that, and
Yeah.
it profoundly challenges Philemon in how he's to treat his slaves as well. So yeah, powerful. Any closing thoughts, Dr. John Lowley?
It's interesting what you say. It's quite true to not take a verse out of context. Because it says in the Bible, there is no God. You can find that in the Psalms.
Yes.
There is no God. That's the teaching in the Bible. There is no God. But if you look at the context of the verse, it says, the fool says in his heart, there is no God.
Right. It's really helpful. Yeah, keep it in context. Laudo, any final thoughts?
And absolutely. I mean, I think it's just to kind of reiterate what people are saying here. The Bible, you've heard people say this all all the time. Again, without reading it in context, but then the Bible has it has no contradictions. Again, you can pick something out of context and you can say, oh, well, this is what I think. Well, no, it's about reading it in context. It's about in this book realizing, okay, first of all, like, why is it being written? It's being written to people who, as we said, were getting false teaching. It was being written with Paul, cheekily trying to, like I said, kind of tear down this whole structure of slavery, of this Roman Empire kind of structure. And again, I think understanding all of these things helps to understand the dynamics of husbands and wives, understanding the dynamics of masters and slaves in that time, now looking at it in a different way. And again, I think it just comes down to, again, as people have said, not being afraid to ask questions, but at the same time, not being afraid to kind of tear down any preconceptions that we have in our mind of what's true and what's not as well.
Brilliant. Yeah, I think that's really, really helpful. And I guess that's our heart with this podcast as well, is that it maybe even in just a small way has helped you to understand the Bible a little bit more. We really do pray that it has blessed you, and we will see you next time in the next episode.